Kale-7 had no name that anyone called with warmth. He was a number, a designation stamped into his file by the Vorkai Empire, when they first grew him in a pressurized tank of dark fluid and harder science. He was not born the way most creatures were born. He was manufactured, assembled, tested, and deployed like a piece of military equipment, because that was exactly what he was. The Vorkai Empire had needed a weapon that could think. Other weapons, guns, bombs, battleships, could not adapt. They could not read a battlefield and change their method in the middle of a fight. They could not look at an enemy and understand them well enough to anticipate the next move. Kale-7 could do all of those things, and he could do them faster than any natural being in the Empire's military. He had been their greatest project and their most expensive investment. And then the Empire had collapsed, burned from within by political rot and a civil war that none of its military machines had been designed to prevent. And Kale-7 had found himself without orders for the first time in his existence. He remembered that feeling, or what passed for feeling, in his wired-up nervous system. It had not been grief. Grief required attachment, and he had been engineered specifically without it. It had been something closer to a system running idle, a turbine spinning without a load, generating energy with nowhere for it to go. He had eventually found mercenary work. It was the most honest thing available to something like him. You had a problem, you paid a rate, he solved the problem, and everyone went back to their lives. No loyalty required. No emotion required. Just capability, which he had in abundance. 17 years had passed that way. 17 years of contracts and corridors and cold ships and the long silence between star systems. He had fought for corporations, for small governments, for criminal organizations, when the pay was right and the work did not involve civilians. He had a line. Not a moral one exactly, more of a practical one. Hurting civilians was messy, it drew attention, and it made future contracts harder to secure. So he avoided it not out of conscience, but out of efficiency. At least that was what he told himself. He was traveling toward Cathara Station when his navigation system flagged the distress beacon. It was a weak signal, and weakness in a distress signal usually meant honesty. Fake beacons, the kind set by pirates to lure salvagers into an ambush, were always strong and clean and professionally broadcast. This one stuttered and repeated with the raw, unpolished desperation of something real, something small, something scared. It originated from a research outpost on the edge of the Cathara Nebula. The nebula itself was an annoyance, thick magnetic interference that slowed navigation and damaged sensors if you flew too deep into it. Most commercial routes went around it. The outpost was the kind of place that existed precisely because it was inconvenient to reach, which meant it was also inconvenient to defend. Kale-7 had a contract waiting at Cathara Station. It was a corporate extraction job, well-paying, logistically simple. He did not need the detour. He did not do charity work. He almost bypassed the signal entirely. But the beacon carried a secondary civilian classification tag, with a child identifier attached. His targeting system, which was never fully off, even when he slept, flagged it and held it in his attention the way a magnet holds a piece of metal, steady and without explanation. He adjusted course. The research outpost was badly damaged when he arrived. One of its 3 habitat modules had been vented to space, its walls peeled outward by what looked like a shaped charge, precisely placed. That was not the work of pirates. Pirates were sloppy. This was professional work, the kind done by people with a specific goal and a timetable. The remaining 2 modules still had emergency power and atmosphere. He docked, cycled through the airlock in full armor, and swept the interior with his handheld scanner. 1 life sign, small, low thermal output, tucked behind a supply crate in the 2nd module. He moved through the connecting corridor without sound, which was an impressive feat for something his size, and he stepped into the 2nd module and found the child. It was Aelith. He recognized the species immediately. Iridescent skin that shifted color slightly with emotion, large dark eyes, a small and delicate build that looked entirely unsuited for a place like this. The child was wrapped in a thermal blanket 3 times its size, and it was shaking, not just from the cold. It looked up at him. He looked back. The child processed the sight of him. 8 feet of engineered mass in battle armor, a face that had been broken and reset so many times it carried its history like a map. And Kale 7 waited to see what it would do. What it did was launch itself forward. 2 small running steps, a reach upward, and both of its tiny hands grabbed the hem of his armored coat and held on with a grip that was desperate and absolute, and somehow, despite everything, trusting. And it spoke, in broken, shaking galactic common, the words falling over each other like it had rehearsed them in the dark 100 times and was terrified of getting them wrong. Mighty human, my mother was taken. Save her. Kale 7 looked down at those hands. They were so small that together they could not wrap around one of his fingers. He looked at the child's face. The red-rimmed eyes, the trembling lip, the hope that lived there like a fire that refused to go out, even after everything else had been put out around it. He processed the request. He almost walked away. He had no contract here, no payment, no operational reason. He was not a rescue service. He was not a protector. He was a weapon, and a weapon without a mission was just weight. But then one word snagged in his processing, like a wire catching on something sharp. Human. The child had called him a human. Kale 7 was not human. He had a human genetic baseline. The Vorkai engineers had used human stock because it was the most adaptable combat material available. But he was something engineered past humanity, something colder and harder and more precisely calibrated for violence. He was not human. But the word landed in him differently than it should have, and he found himself thinking hard about what it meant that the child had used it. Because Kale 7 knew humans, he had been specifically designed to fight them. The Vorkai had deployed him against human resistance cells during the expansion campaigns, and he had studied them as enemies with the thorough attention of something that needed to understand a threat completely. Humans were not the most powerful species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest, not the most armored, not the most biologically dangerous. They did not have venom, or regeneration, or psychic ability. By raw biological metrics, they were average at best. What they had was something that the Vorkai battle planners had never successfully modeled. They refused to quit. Not when they were losing, not when the math was against them, not when any rational analysis said the fight was over and it was time to stand down. When something that mattered to them was threatened, a person, a community, a principle, humans fought with a specific, irrational ferocity that broke every predictive model because it did not come from logic. It came from somewhere else entirely. The galaxy did not fear humans because of their strength. It feared them because of their refusal, because you could beat a human down and they would get back up, not because they had calculated the odds, but because someone they loved was still behind them and they were not finished yet. This small, frightened, grieving child had looked at Kale 7, at his size, at his armor, at his scarred and broken face, and had seen that quality. He did not correct the child. He stood very still for a long moment, the tiny hands still gripping his coat, and he spoke, his voice low and flat, like the sound of a hull settling in the cold of space. Who took her? The child's grip tightened. Its breath came out in a sound that was grief and relief at the same time, a sound that Kale 7 filed away in his memory and did not quite know what to do with. And it began to talk, everything it had been holding alone in the dark, pouring out in a rush, every detail falling forward like it had been waiting behind a door this whole time. Kale 7 listened to every word. He stood there, enormous and armored and expressionless, and he listened. and when the child was finished, he reached down and placed one large hand briefly on top of its head. Not a program gesture, not something from any training file, just something that happened on its own, from some part of him that had never been fully switched on before. "Tell me everything," he said. And in the cold wreckage of a forgotten outpost at the edge of a difficult nebula, a living weapon found the first thing in 17 years that felt like a reason to be exactly what he was. She was 7 years old by Aelith counting, which translated to roughly 9 by galactic standard. Old enough to understand that her mother was in danger. Young enough that the weight of it was almost more than she could carry. She had been on the research outpost with her mother, Elder Laura, while Elder Laura conducted what she called archive maintenance, the careful process of receiving and organizing memory transfers from other Aelith elders across the nearby systems. Sevi had been sleeping when the attack came. She had woken to the sound of the external module being breached, to shouting she did not understand, and to her mother's voice telling her to hide behind the supply crates and stay absolutely still, no matter what happened. She had stayed there for what her internal sense of time told her was almost 2 full days, surviving on the ration bars her mother had pressed into her hands before the attackers took her away. She had activated the distress beacon on the 2nd day, when she decided that hope was more useful than silence. Kale 7 listened to all of this without expression as he piloted his ship away from the ruined outpost and onto a course for the nearest major transit hub. Sevi sat in the co-pilot seat, which was far too large for her, wrapped in the thermal blanket and eating a ration pack from his supplies with the focused intensity of a child who had not eaten properly in 2 days. "Who were they?" he asked, not looking away from the navigation screen. "I did not see their faces," Sevi said. "They wore dark gear with no markings, but I heard one of them say a word before they left." She paused, pressing her lips together in concentration. "They used the word ash." Kale 7's hands stayed still on the controls, but something in his processing shifted. He knew that word in context. The Conclave of Ash was not a name you heard often in honest company. It was a political faction. Old money, old power, old methods that operated on the edge of galactic law by staying just barely inside it. They did not start wars. They prevented truths from becoming public. They made inconvenient people disappear in ways that were hard to trace and even harder to prosecute. They were not pirates. They were something considerably worse. "What does your mother do?" he asked. Sevi's expression shifted. Something careful and proud moved across her iridescent features. "She is an archivist," she said. "The Aelith do not write things down. We pass memories, elder to elder, through touch and ceremony. My mother holds the memories of many elders who are gone now. She says she carries the voices of people who would otherwise be forgotten." "What kind of memories?" "I do not know all of them," Sevi admitted. "But Mother told me once that she carries something very old, a treaty memory from before the expansion wars, something that 2 sides agreed to and then never honored." She looked at Kale 7 steadily, her dark eyes clear and certain. She said that if that memory was ever verified and presented to the right people, it would cause very large problems for very powerful interests. There it was. Kale 7 understood the complete picture now. Elder Laura was not a random target. She had been specifically identified as holding something dangerous, not a conventional weapon, not classified data in any technical sense, but information encoded in biological memory that could destabilize political arrangements that powerful groups had spent decades carefully maintaining. They had taken her to extract that information, or to ensure she never had the chance to pass it on. The transit hub of Malveris was a city built into the ring system of a gas giant, a sprawling, layered structure of docking bays and commercial sectors and information markets that never fully slept. It was the kind of place where you could find almost anyone if you knew how to ask, and where asking the wrong question to the wrong person could end your life before the next station rotation. Kale 7 had been there before. He docked in a lower bay, paid for 3 hours with untraceable credit, and moved through the station with Sevi walking quickly beside him. Her hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers because the crowds were large and she was small, and the alternative was losing her in the press of bodies. He noted the reactions as they moved through the commercial level. Other species gave him space, not because they recognized what he was, but because his size and his bearing communicated something that most living creatures understood without needing it explained. He was not something you bumped into and then apologized to. He was something you moved around. But here and there he caught a different kind of reaction. A table of Grath merchants fell quiet when he passed, and one of them leaned to another and said something in a low voice. A pair of Veka traders subtly changed their walking direction to put more distance between themselves and his path. A station security officer, a large Dorn, heavily built, someone who would not flinch at most things, looked at Kale 7 once, and then looked away very deliberately, the way you looked away from something you did not want to give a reason to notice you. Sevi noticed. "Why do they look at you like that?" she asked quietly. "They think I am human," Kale 7 said. "Are you not?" He considered the question for longer than it required. "No," he said finally. "But you move like the stories say humans move," Sevi said, with the directness that children sometimes had, saying out loud the thing that adults had already decided not to say. "Like you are always looking for a fight, but hoping you do not have to have one." Kale 7 did not respond to that, but he filed it away carefully. The contact he needed was a Veka information broker named Thuris, who operated out of a back section of the 3rd commercial ring, behind a legitimate cargo assessment office. Thuris owed Kale 7 a professional debt from a previous arrangement, the kind of debt that never fully disappeared until it was paid. When they entered the back room, Thuris looked up from his terminal, took one long look at Kale 7, and became very still. The stillness of someone who had just understood their situation and was deciding how to respond to it. "I need the current location of a conclave of ash detention transport," Kale 7 said, without preamble and without sitting down. "They took an Aelith elder from Kethra outpost approximately 52 hours ago. The elder's name is Laura. I need to know where she is being held." Thuris was quiet for a long moment. His 4 eyes moved from Kale 7 to Sevi, and then back to Kale 7. "That is deep water," he said carefully. "You owe me," Kale 7 said. Just those 3 words. Nothing added. Thuris held the quiet for a shorter time this time. He turned to his terminal and began working with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided that the cost of cooperation was lower than the cost of refusal. What he found was not a specific location. The conclave was too careful for fixed locations, but a name and a profile. Thresh Station, a mobile detention facility maintained by a private security consortium with conclave financing. It did not stay in any single position for more than 72 hours, which made it difficult to target and nearly impossible to raid without precise timing. Thuris pulled up the projected movement path and laid it across the screen. They had 61 hours before Thresh Station moved to its next position outside of practical reach. Kale 7 stood very still and calculated. The math was not comfortable. 61 hours to locate, approach, infiltrate, extract, and clear a mobile high-security facility. But it was workable if there was no margin for error and no time wasted. He had operated in worse windows before. He looked down at Sevi, who was looking at the projected path on the screen with an expression that held fear and determination in equal measure, balanced against each other the way 2 heavy things balance on a narrow point. Can you get her back? Sevi asked. Her voice was steady. Kale-7 noticed that, and noted it as remarkable. A child who had spent 2 days alone in a broken outpost, waiting for someone to come, asking the only important question, without letting her voice fall apart. He looked at the screen. He looked at what the operation required, against what he had available. Yes, he said. He had spoken that word many times in professional contexts. Yes to contracts, yes to briefings, yes to logistics confirmations. It had always meant, I am capable of the task, and I will deliver the stated result. This time, it meant something additional that he did not have clean language for. Something to do with the small being standing beside him. Something to do with the fact that he had made a promise in a cold, broken room, and intended to keep it in a way that went beyond professional reliability. He noticed the difference. He stored it carefully, the way you stored something fragile that you are not yet sure what to do with. Stay close to me at all times until we are back on the ship. Sevi nodded once, sharp, certain, the nod of someone who understood instructions and intended to follow them. And Thuris watched them leave his back room, and then sat very quietly for a long time afterward, thinking about the way the large armored figure had said the word, yes, and thinking that whoever had taken the Aelith Elder had made a very specific and very serious kind of mistake. The kind that did not announce itself until it was far too late to correct. It was designed to look like wreckage from a distance, a dead freighter, a decommissioned ore platform, something abandoned and not worth a second scan. Its running lights were off, and its heat signature was carefully managed to fall within the background noise of surrounding space. A casual sensor sweep would pass right over it, without a second thought. Kale-7 did not do casual sensor sweeps. He spent the entire approach running detailed passive scans, building a picture of the station's layout, layer by layer. He mapped the docking bays, the power distribution corridors, the likely guard rotation positions, the emergency bulkhead locations. He did it the way he did everything, systematically, without emotion, treating the problem as pure geometry that needed to be understood before it could be solved. Sevi watched him work from the co-pilot seat, legs too short to reach the floor, hands folded in her lap, with a patience that was not comfortable, but was disciplined. You are very quiet when you plan, she said after a long stretch of silence. Yes, he agreed. My mother is quiet when she works too, Sevi said. She says that thinking and talking use the same part of the mind, and you cannot do both well at the same time. She paused for a moment. Are you frightened? Kale-7 considered the question with genuine attention instead of dismissing it. No, he said. I do not produce fear the way most beings do. It was removed from my base response system during development. Sevi considered this with the serious expression she used for serious things. Does that make you sad? I do not produce sadness either, he said. She looked at him for a long moment with those large dark eyes. Then what do you feel right now? And that was the question that stopped him, because the answer his internal monitoring systems returned was not nothing. Something was running in him that he did not have a clean label for. A kind of heightened activation, a state of sharpened focus that was not purely tactical. It had something to do with the small being sitting beside him, and with the elder sitting somewhere in the station ahead, and with the fact that he had made a promise he intended to keep. I feel ready, he said, which was not the whole truth, but was the part of the truth he knew how to put into words. He left Sevi on the ship with the door sealed, and the emergency departure sequence programmed to her palm print. If he was not back in 3 hours, the ship would take her to the nearest inhabited system automatically. He explained this to her twice, and told her it was not negotiable. She made him promise to come back. He said yes. He did not say it lightly. The infiltration began with the docking approach. He came in on a slow, dark trajectory that mirrored the drift profile of a piece of debris, using minimal thruster output and cutting his ship's active systems to near zero. The station's external sensors were built for powered approach vectors. A slow, cold, drifting thing did not trigger the same alarm protocols. He made contact with the hull on the maintenance side, anchored with a magnetic clamp, and cut a manual entry through a secondary access panel that fed into the station's service corridor network. The inside of Thresh Station smelled like recycled air, an institutional cleaner, and something underneath both of those things that Kale 7 recognized from other detention facilities. The particular quality of a place where people were kept against their will for extended periods, where the air itself had absorbed what was happening in the rooms around it. The guard rotation was predictable. He had mapped it from external timing during his approach. The heat signatures of moving bodies had told him the patrol pattern. 4 minutes between passes in the service corridors, 6 in the main detention ring. He moved inside those windows with the unhurried precision of something that had done this kind of work many times before and knew exactly where the edges were. He put 3 guards to sleep silently before any alarm was raised, not killing, just ensuring they would be unconscious and confused for the next several hours. He had the capability to kill easily, and he was aware of it at all times. But unconscious guards were a facility problem. Dead guards were a political event that drew attention and made the extraction harder to complete without pursuit. He reached the guard station for the detention ring. That was where the clean part of the plan ended. The alert did not come from a guard he had missed. It came from an automated proximity sensor mounted in the ceiling of the 4th service corridor. A sensor that appeared on no standard facility schematic because it had been added specifically and recently, which meant someone had anticipated the possibility of a rescue attempt and had prepared for it. Every alarm in the station hit simultaneously. The lighting shifted to emergency red throughout all sections, and from 4 separate access points, armed personnel came through the doors in tight tactical formation, not standard station security and basic gear, but something considerably better equipped and better trained, moving in coordinated patterns that spoke of serious military experience and recent practice. Kale 7 assessed all of it in approximately 1 second, then he moved. What followed was the kind of fighting the Vorkai had designed him for. Not clean, not surgical, but deeply adaptive. He had no fixed combat style that could be studied and countered. He read each engagement in real time and responded to it as its own specific problem. He used corridor geometry, exploited the guards' formations, turned their own momentum and firing angles against them. He absorbed hits that would have ended most combatants. A close-range discharge from a pulse rifle caught him in the left shoulder, and he registered it as heat and impact data. A second hit to his lower back staggered him for half a step, and he used the stumble to redirect himself directly into the guard who had fired that shot, and remove that guard from the equation. He heard one of them shout into a comm unit, voice cracking under pressure. "It fights like a human. It thinks like a human." He heard that. Through everything happening around him, the noise, the movement, the damage reports his body was sending up, he heard that specific sentence, and it landed in him differently than any of the physical impacts had. Some part of him held those words and turned them over while the rest of him kept fighting, and what he found when he examined them was that he did not disagree. He broke through to the detention ring. He found the cell block registry panel and ran Elder Laura's name against the assignment records, and got a location. Cell block 7, Unit 4, medical status listed as sedated. He was 40 meters from Unit 4 when the second alarm layer activated. The floor section ahead sealed behind heavy blast doors that dropped from the ceiling with the solid final sound of something that had been waiting to close. This was not a standard security protocol triggering in sequence. It was a deliberate trap, pre-configured and manually triggered from somewhere deeper in the station. from a ceiling speaker above the blast door, a voice came through that was calm and unhurried and precisely controlled, the voice of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "You should stop now," the voice said. "You have no contract here. You have no payment. You are a weapon operating outside any sanctioned context, which means you are malfunctioning. Weapons that malfunction get shut down." Kale 7 recognized the profile from intelligence files. Overseer Vaughn, the Conclave's senior field operative, a methodical and patient Sarathi who had run more than 40 disappearance operations without a single formal charge ever reaching him. "Stand down and walk away," Vaughn continued, his tone reasonable and even. "The Aelith Elder carries information that must not enter public record. This is not personal. This is political maintenance. You have no stake in this outcome. You have no connection to these people. You are expending yourself for nothing." And then, from somewhere behind the blast doors, muffled by the heavy metal but unmistakable to his enhanced hearing, Kale 7 heard a small voice. Sevi's voice. She had not stayed on the ship. She had followed him in, been picked up by a patrol somewhere in the outer corridors, and was now somewhere on the other side of that blast door, in Conclave hands, scared but not silent, her voice loud and clear even through the metal. Something shifted hard in Kale 7's operational state. It was not panic. He was built without the architecture for panic. But it was something intense and absolute and focused that pushed every available system toward a single point, like a beam of light being narrowed. He looked at the blast door. The door was rated for serious ordnance. His hands were not ordnance. He examined the frame with careful attention. He examined the hinge construction. He examined the pressure housing on the locking mechanism. And he saw something that a standard tactical assessment would have filed as irrelevant. A stress fracture in the secondary housing, a manufacturing flaw that had been sitting there since the station was built, widening slowly under the constant vibration of station systems. He placed both hands against the frame at precise locations. He applied force not to the door itself, but to the already compromised housing, directing pressure exactly where the fracture ran, in a way that required understanding the material and its failure point, rather than simply hitting harder and hoping. The housing gave. The lock released. The blast door ground open on damaged runners, slow and grinding and final. Kale 7 stepped through into the smoke and the red light on the other side, battered, hit in multiple places, leaking from 3 separate impact sites, one arm at reduced function. Standing and still moving and still coming forward. And in that moment, in the way he moved and the reason he was moving and the absolute refusal to stop that was written into every step, he looked exactly like what the small child in the broken outpost had believed him to be from the very first moment she had looked up and grabbed his coat. The space beyond the blast door was a large secondary hold, not a cell block, but a staging area, the kind of room used for processing and preparation rather than long-term keeping. It had high ceilings, heavy equipment bolted to the walls, and harsh white lighting that made everything look clinical and without mercy. Overseer Vaughn was standing in the center of it. He was tall for his species, a Sarathi, lean and long-limbed, with silver-gray skin and eyes that were entirely pale, without visible pupils, which gave his gaze the quality of something that was always looking at you from a great distance, even when it was standing close. He wore a long coat over his operational gear, and his posture was the posture of someone who had complete confidence in the situation around him. He was flanked by 8 armed personnel, all in the same high-grade tactical equipment as the teams in the corridor outside. Sevi was against the far wall, held by a guard. Not hurt, not physically harmed, but frightened, her iridescent skin flushed nearly white, the way Aelith's skin went when the fear was deep enough. Beside her, in a medical chair with restraints and monitoring equipment attached, was an Aelith Elder. Elder Laura. She was conscious, barely. The sedation was wearing off, and she was blinking slowly, trying to orient herself, her eyes moving through the room with the careful effort of someone climbing back up from very far under. She was older than Kale 7 had expected. Her iridescent skin carried the deep, settled quality of great age, like old glass that had seen more light than it could hold. Even sedated and restrained, and in a place like this, she had a quality of stillness that was not defeat. It was something older and more rooted than defeat, something that had been standing long before this room existed, and intended to be standing long after it was gone. Vaughn looked at Kale 7, and the look was not afraid. It was appraising, the look of someone examining an interesting and unexpected variable in an otherwise well-controlled situation. "You are remarkable," Vaughn said, with the tone of someone who meant it as analysis rather than flattery. "I reviewed your construction file before this operation. A Vorkai bioweapon, their finest iteration by all recorded metrics. You should be the most efficient instrument of directed force ever created." He tilted his head slightly. "And yet here you are, in a situation with zero personal benefit, sustaining significant damage for the sake of an alien child and her archival class mother. Why?" Kale 7 did not answer. He was tracking the room, all 8 guards, their positions, their lines of fire, the equipment on the walls, the exits, the distance between himself and Sevi, the distance between himself and the medical chair. He was calculating on multiple levels simultaneously, and what the calculations were telling him was that 8 trained and armed opponents in a closed room, when he was already carrying significant damage, was not a comfortable equation. "I will tell you why," Vaughn continued, with the patience of someone who believed he had time and intended to use it. "Because something in your programming has developed an error over time. You were constructed as a tool, and tools do not make choices based on emotional attachment. But you have been operating without a principle for 17 years, and systems that run without direction develop drift, small errors that accumulate." He gestured mildly with one hand. "You have begun to simulate the behaviors of the beings whose genetic material forms your base template. You are mimicking humanity without understanding that you are doing it, and that is a malfunction, not a purpose." "Mother," Sevi called out from across the room, not to Kale 7, but to the elder, who was blinking more steadily now, whose eyes had found her daughter's face and were holding on to it with the fierce, awake grip of someone who had been very far away and had just found their way back. Vaughn ignored the child entirely. His attention stayed on Kale 7. "Walk away," he said. "You cannot win this room in your current state. The math does not support it. I am offering you a rational exit. Leave, recover, find your next contract. We will process the elder, complete the extraction, and this will be concluded quietly. You will have lost nothing that was ever yours." Kale 7 looked at the room. He looked at the 8 guards. He ran the damage assessment his internal monitoring was feeding him. The shoulder was compromised. His lower back had a structural issue, reducing his movement efficiency by roughly 12%, and he had 3 impact sites that were actively leaking. He looked at the numbers, and he recognized that Vaughn was not wrong about the math. The math was genuinely uncomfortable. He looked at Sevi, skin white with fear, gripped tight on the arm of the guard holding her, eyes fixed on him with an expression that was not asking him to save her, but was not looking away from him either. He looked at Elder Laura, who had found his face now, this massive, battered, bleeding thing standing in her doorway, and she was looking at him with an expression that was neither afraid nor confused. She was looking at him the way you looked at something you had been expecting. Not something you recognized, but something you had been told was coming, and had decided to trust before it arrived. He looked at Vaughn. "The math has never worked," Kale 7 said. "That has never stopped me." He moved. He did not go for Vaughn first. Vaughn was positioned with maximum guard coverage, a difficult reach by design. He went for the room itself, for the geometry of it, for the ways it could be made to work for him instead of against him. He used the heavy wall equipment as cover and as obstacles. He forced guards to adjust their positions, and in adjusting to block each other's firing lines. He moved with that adaptive, unreadable quality that made fighting him so difficult. The refusal to fight the engagement that had been planned for him. The insistence on creating a different engagement in real time from whatever materials the room provided. He was hit twice more, both significant. One impact took his left arm to partial function. Another caught him across the ribs on the right side, and he registered the crack of something giving, and processed it as information, and kept moving, because stopping was not one of the options he was considering. One by one, the room reorganized itself, not cleanly, not without cost, but steadily in the direction he was pushing it. Toward the wall where Sevi stood. Toward the medical chair where Elder Laura sat with her hands gripping the armrests, and her eyes tracking him across the room with fierce, wide-awake attention. He stepped between her and the guard holding her with the simple, massive finality of a door closing. The kind of thing you did not argue with. The guard made a short sound and released her immediately, and took several steps back without being asked. Sevi grabbed him, both arms around his arm, her face pressed hard against his armored side, holding on with the specific grip of someone who had let go once in a cold, broken room, and had no intention of doing it again. He moved to Elder Laura's chair. His one fully functional arm worked the restraints. They were designed for compliance, rather than for someone actively working from the outside, and he had them clear in seconds. Laura stood. She was unsteady, but she stood, pulling herself upright with the deliberate effort of someone who had decided to stand, and was going to stand, regardless of what her body said about it. She looked up at him, this ancient archivist of a dying people, carrying in her biological memory the voices of the gone, and the weight of something powerful enough that organized and well-funded forces had arranged her abduction. And she spoke to him in Aelith. He did not speak Aelith. His translation system was limited to the most common galactic tongues. But one word came through with a fragment definition attached, flagged as a cultural term without a clean equivalent in any other language. It translated in pieces. Guardian, chosen stranger, one who was lost and found a way home. She said that word to him with the certainty of someone who had thought about it and meant it exactly. Something in him received that word and held it. He did not have the language to describe what it did to him. He only knew that it went somewhere deep and stayed there. Vaughn's remaining operatives had reorganized behind him. The situation was not resolved, not by a long distance. He was damaged and inside a hostile facility, and the exit required moving back through corridors that were now fully alerted and reinforced. Vaughn's voice came from somewhere in the reshuffled room, controlled and unhurt, a composed creature watching a variable that had not behaved as predicted, but was still inside a manageable situation. This changes very little. You cannot extract 3 people from this station in your current condition. The numbers do not support it, and you are experienced enough to know that. Kale 7 looked at Elder Laura, who was standing steadily now, holding onto the chair with one hand, but no longer needing it to stay upright, and looking at the room around her with the calm attention of someone taking careful inventory rather than panicking. He looked at Sevi, who had moved from his arm to her mother's side, and had taken her mother's hand in both of her own, and was holding on with the particular grip of a child who was never letting go of this again. "What is the fastest route to the docking ring from this section?" he asked Laura directly. She looked at him with something that moved across her expression quickly, something that was respect and interest at the same time. "You are asking me? You were held here long enough to observe the layout. You are Aelith. You remember everything you observe." The expression settled into something certain. She turned and pointed without hesitation toward the left side corridor access. "Then stay close and stay behind me," he said. And the living weapon, damaged and leaking and running on something that was not tactical calculation anymore, but was something more absolute and less explainable, moved his people toward the exit. Because they were his people now. He had decided that somewhere in the middle of everything that had just happened, without asking permission from any part of himself that might have argued against it, and the decision sat in him with the settled weight of something that had been true for a long time and had only just been named. The extraction from Thresh Station was not clean. It was loud and hard, and it cost Kale 7 2 more impacts before they cleared the outer corridor. One that cracked something on his right side, and one that caught him across the back of the head and made his vision flicker for 3 full seconds, which was a long time when everything around you was moving fast and required your full attention. Elder Laura moved faster than he had expected, for someone who had been sedated for days. Age had made her lean rather than fragile, and she had spent her captivity paying careful attention to the layout of every corridor she had been moved through, filing it all in that precise Aelith memory like a map drawn in the dark. Sevi did not slow them down either. She ran. They made the docking bay with 4 minutes to spare before Vaughn's reorganized teams cut off that route entirely. Kale 7 put Sevi and Laura through the airlock first, and then held the corridor for those 4 minutes, standing in the gap between his people and what was coming, taking what came, not giving an inch. Not a contract, not a payment, not a mission directive from any authority that had a claim on him. Just 2 specific people on the other side of that airlock who needed 4 minutes, and he was the only thing available to provide them. He made it through. He sealed the airlock, released the docking clamps at a speed that left marks on his own collar, and pushed the ship to full burn on the first clear vector out of the station's reach. Thresh Station did not pursue. It was not built for pursuit, and its commanding officer had a considerable internal situation to manage before authorizing anything else. They cleared the engagement range. And then there was quiet. The particular quality of deep space quiet, where the only sounds were the engines and the recycled air, and the small sounds of living creatures breathing in a shared closed space. Kale 7 sat in the pilot seat and ran diagnostics on his damage and let the autopilot hold the course and did not turn around. Behind him, in the small passenger section, Elder Laura and Sevi held each other without speaking, because some reunions do not need words. They need only the physical confirmation that the other person is real and present and warm and breathing, that the space where they had been absent is filled again. He gave them that. Elder Laura came forward after a time and sat in the co-pilot seat. She looked at his damage with direct, unsentimental attention, the look of someone who had cared for many beings over a long life and had no patience for pretending that obvious things were not obvious. "You need medical attention," she said. "I need to set a course first," he replied. "Both things can be true at the same time," she said, with a gentle certainty that was unlike anything he encountered in professional or combat contexts. The certainty of someone who was used to caring for things and saw no reason to stop simply because the thing in question was large and armored and technically designed for war. He gave her the course setting, a hidden Aelith sanctuary world that Sevi had provided coordinates for before the operation, a small colony in an unmapped system that existed precisely because it was difficult to find and had never given anyone a reason to look harder. Then he let the conversation fall quiet again. During the long stretch of travel, he asked Laura about the treaty memory, the thing the Conclave had been willing to arrange an abduction to suppress. She explained it with the measured clarity of someone who had carried something for a long time and knew its exact weight. It was a peace agreement from before the expansion wars, a documented understanding between 2 major political bodies that had been quietly buried when both sides found it more profitable to continue the conflict than to honor what they had agreed to. The agreement had consequences that were still relevant, that still had binding implications for arrangements that powerful interests had built on top of the assumption that it did not exist. "Can it be verified?" he asked. "Aelith memory is not interpretation," she said. "It is direct biological record, the equivalent of a recording made by the original witness. Under proper neutral arbitration protocol, it cannot be dismissed as fabrication." That is what they feared. Not the memory itself, but the moment it became public and verified and impossible to deny. "Then we make it public," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You say that as though it is a simple thing." "It is not simple," he agreed, "but it is the next step, and the next step is always the thing that matters." She was quiet for a moment after that, and the quiet had something thoughtful and warm in it, that he noticed without knowing exactly what to do with it. They reached the sanctuary world without further incident. It was small and green, and hidden in a system whose star burned dim and quiet. A world that had survived precisely because it asked nothing of the galaxy, and the galaxy had not looked for it. The landing area was a cleared section of forest floor, simple and unmechanized, the kind of place that did not expect large armored ships and made room for them anyway. The colony came out to meet them. It was not large, a few hundred Aelith, elders and children and the adults who cared for both. They came out with the careful, quiet attention of people who had learned to be cautious about arrivals. And that caution shifted into something different the moment they saw Elder Laura step out of the ship. There was no noise. The Aelith were not a loud people. But there was a coming together, a gathering of hands and voices in their own language and foreheads briefly pressed to Laura's in the greeting reserved for those who had been feared lost and had returned. Sevi stood in the middle of all of it, with her mother's hand in both of her own, and did not release it. Kale 7 stood at the edge of the landing area and watched from a distance. He told himself he was monitoring the perimeter for threats, which was true. He did not tell himself that it was the only reason he was watching, because that would not have been true. Over the days that followed, while the colony's medical specialist worked methodically through his damage list, and Elder Laura began the careful process of reaching out to neutral arbitration contacts through encrypted channels, Kale 7 stayed. He told himself it was operational, that he needed to confirm the arbitration route was secure before he could responsibly leave. That was true, and was also not the complete reason. He repaired the colony's external sensor array, which was outdated and had coverage gaps that bothered him. He reinforced the structural weak points in the landing area. He ran quiet perimeter checks at the hours that a security assessment of the colony's vulnerabilities suggested were the highest risk windows. None of it had been requested. None of it was the kind of work he had spent 17 years doing. He did it anyway. Elder Laura found him on the third evening, sitting at the outer edge of the colony, where the tree line began, watching the dim star set slowly behind the canopy. She sat beside him, without asking if she could, and with the ease of someone who had made a decision about the company she was keeping, and was comfortable with it. "You are still here," she said. "The arbitration channel is not fully secured," he said. "It was secured this afternoon," she said. He was quiet. "You can stay," she said, after giving the quiet its appropriate space. "If you choose to. There is no requirement, no obligation, no expectation attached to the offer. But the offer is real, and it is meant." He thought about his ship, and the empty route to the next contract, and the long silence between systems that he had told himself for 17 years was simply the nature of his existence. He thought about the word Laura had said to him in that staging room on Thresh Station, the one that his translation system had returned in fragments. Guardian, chosen stranger, one who was lost and found a way home. He did not answer her directly. But in the morning, when he walked to the landing area with his travel pack, Sevi was already there. She had not been told he was leaving. She had simply known, the way children sometimes knew things, and she had come early and waited. She did not beg him to stay. She did not cry. She looked up at him with those large dark eyes that had found him in a broken outpost and seen something in him that he was still, slowly, learning to see in himself. And she held out something small in both hands. It was a woven band, thin and carefully made in the colors of the sanctuary world, green and dim gold. The work was slightly uneven in the way that small, careful hands still learning a craft produced, and that unevenness made it the most precisely made thing anyone had ever given him. He looked at it. "It is an Aelith binding cord," she said. "We give them only to family." He crouched down to her level, all 8 feet of engineered mass folding itself until it was face to face with her, until the distance between them was the distance between people having an honest conversation. He looked at her face. He held out his wrist. She tied it with great care and great concentration, her small fingers working the traditional knot, the right way, the way that meant something, the way that was not decoration, but declaration. When she finished, she looked up at him, and he looked at her, and the quiet between them was not empty, but full, the way quiet was full when it did not need anything added to it. He stood. He walked to his ship. He flew. And in the stations and trade hubs of the galaxy, in the cargo bays and the back rooms, and the dim corridors where information moved between people who paid attention to interesting things, something new began to be said in careful voices. Not about a Vorkai weapons project drifting between contracts. Not about a monster in old armor taking any job that paid. About something harder to categorize and harder to predict. A large, scarred figure moving between the forgotten outposts and the overlooked places, showing up where the small and the powerless needed something that would not stop, and would not back down, and would not leave until the thing that needed doing was done. He was not human, but the galaxy looked at what he did, and the way he did it, and the reason he did it, and the galaxy did not have another word for what it was looking at. On his wrist, under his armor, in every system and every fight, and every long dark stretch of space between one purpose and the next, a small woven band in green and dim gold sat quietly against his skin. It said everything that needed to be said. He was not lost anymore. And for a living weapon who had spent 17 years generating force with nowhere for it to go, that was the only thing that had ever truly mattered, and he carried it now the way Laura carried her memories, completely, carefully, and without any intention of ever letting it go.